Okay, Danny Dida. Kitsima Tsimoksin. Greetings. I'm Randy Robe, and I've collaborated with Martina Daniels on the Indigenous Epistemological Hybridity. Here is our presentation. Throughout my life, I have learned the philosophies of what it is or how it ought to be as an indigenous person. My life experience have altered my knowledge and way of thinking forever, and it gave me the sense of what the true essence of what it means to be indigenous. This is what epistemological hybridity means to me, and that is the evolving of an indigenous person in these modern times. Here's an example. Being a student in an indigenous studies class, I've learned knowledge and ways from others from different lands, nations, and cultures. It is truly humbling to hear other stories from different walks of life, indigenous and non-indigenous students. My whole life I've lived and learned the westernized philosophies, which even made myself unknowing to my own indigenous philosophies at times. These philosophies led to the micro and macro biases that I can say now that are lived experiences, and these experiences were from eras of life, for instance in school, playing community sports and high school football. At a young age, my oldest sister would tell me that I had to work 200% harder than the rest of my classmates because I am Native. Since hearing that and actually understanding what she meant, empowered me and at times angered me. But as I matured in life, I have learned to live with love and tolerance. Hence, hybridity and its self-actualization of living in both worlds has only made me a stronger person with indigenous knowledge and morphed Western philosophical experiences, positive and negative. Yesterday, I was called First Nations by another professor. A few weeks ago, I was asked if I were Aboriginal. When I was a kid, I was called Native by my peers, and nowadays they changed it yet again. You're now called Indigenous. I just say I am Blackfoot, Siksika, and Nitsitapi, and my mother is Dene from the Tsuut'ina Nation.
When we look into the practical application of epistemological hybridity in society, there are various potential outcomes. Analyzing both positive and negative attributes, we can explore the possibilities that cross-cultural thinking has. Some of the benefits includes marginalized cultural groups and minorities integrating their ideologies into modern-day issues. This not only provides insight of different perspectives to help resolve problems, but promotes the liberation of oppressed cultures. An example includes the concept of two-eyed seeing. Teresa Marsh et al. Explained throughout their article a modern approach to healing the intergenerational soul wounds of Indigenous peoples. This method enables Indigenous epistemologies and healing practices, such as sweat lodge ceremonies and elder discussions, to be integrated into Western practices. Examples of this hybrid approach have been promoted in my hometown, Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, in our correctional facilities. Authorities have implemented on-land activities such as rabbit snaring and trapping, spaces to smudge, and elder discussion with the intention of healing the people rather than punishing them. In my town, intergenerational trauma has been heavily recognized, and we as a community constantly integrate culture back into our lives to heal with decolonizing methodology. Additionally, there can also be negative repercussions to integrating different cultural knowledge systems. As Littleberg shares in his article, Jagged Worldviews Colliding, sometimes cultural groups can be left with a distorted and lost sense of identity. When speaking on the effects of colonization, he says, "They no longer had an Aboriginal worldview, nor did they adopt a Eurocentric worldview. Their consciousness became a random puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, that each person had to attempt to understand. Effects such as this have led to many social issues amongst the Indigenous community, like statistically higher rates of substance abuse, violence, and unemployment. Throughout my upbringing, addiction has run through my family and community as many of us firsthand experience culture loss and the intergenerational effects of residential schools. However, like my dad has demonstrated, through finding inner peace and reclaiming his identity, he's been able to obtain sobriety without westernized practices." When I think about defining Indigenous liberation, my initial thought is how Aboriginal peoples are working to reclaim their culture that was once oppressed. By integrating Indigenous epistemologies with Western knowledge, it allows for more voice in the dominant mainstream society, moving away from the marginalized and inferior reputation that underlies the prejudiced viewpoints of non-Indigenous people. With more exposure and respect to the brilliance of Indigenous knowledge, it enables Indigenous peoples to self-govern and readopt their culture, helping the soul-healing process of the collective community. The Sacred Wolf Lodge in Saskatchewan, an Indigenously run group home for the Cowessess First Nation girls that are in the foster care system, is a recent example of this. The home reconnects girls with their culture in a safe environment rather than in the mainstream system located outside of their reserve. In my hometown, we have a system similar to this called Trail Cross. However, our efforts to implement Indigenous epistemologies don't stop there. Throughout my elementary and high school education, my schools have provided many culture camps where we learned traditional activities such as sewing, hunting, canoeing, archery, storytelling, dene games, Arctic sports, hand games, etc. Reflecting back, I initially think of my experience doing a 13.5-kilometer hike to Sweetgrass. There we spent 3 to 4 days with no cell service on the land, learning to work as a team, hunt, gather, and respect our land and culture. All these various camps and school trips embodied youth with their cultural identities and reinforced the importance of traditions. Implementing these practices have not only aided in building a healthy relationship with culture, but contributes to the growing Indigenous liberation in upcoming generations. To conclude, we hope that you've learned the differences between each culture's epistemologies, with understanding that we each carry a responsibility to respect all ways of knowing for the hybridity to be carried out in a beneficial way for not only Indigenous liberation, but for all cultures. Masi Cho.